I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The hinge, rusted from years of damp sea air, had a habit of groaning, and my father, in his haste to avoid confrontation, had failed to latch it securely. It was a small mercy, I suppose, this sliver of sound, this accidental window into the mechanics of my own undoing. My stepmother's voice, sharp and brittle as spun sugar, carried most clearly. "Dress the pretty one first," she had said, the words a clinical assessment of assets. "The Duke of Alistair is not a man who will be swayed by a sharp mind in a drab dress. We have one chance, one daughter of value in this transaction. See that Lavinia is presented as such." My father's reply was a low, defeated murmur, the sound of a man who had long ago surrendered the tiller of his own life to a more determined captain. I did not need to hear his words to know their shape. Acquiescence, weary and absolute. I was the drab dress. I was the sharp mind, a liability in a world that prized ornamentation over substance in its women. Lavinia was the pretty one, the daughter of value, the porcelain figurine to be placed upon the mantelpiece of a ducal estate in exchange for our family's salvation. I stood in the hallway, my hand resting on a stack of linens I had been sent to fetch, and felt the familiar weight of my own invisibility settle upon my shoulders like a shroud. It was not a cruel weight, not any more. It was simply a fact, as certain as the tide's retreat from the shingled shore beyond our windows. The reason for my marginalization was a simple, unadorned truth. I was not beautiful. Where my half-sister Lavinia was all rose-gold curls, eyes the colour of a summer sky, and a laugh like wind chimes, I was a creature of muted tones. My hair was the brown of wet earth, my eyes a sober grey, my smile a rare and hesitant thing. I was the second daughter, the quiet one, the one who managed the household ledgers in the dead of night, stretching my father's dwindling funds with a magician's skill, while he and my stepmother wrung their hands and spoke of ruin. They did not know I did this. They believed the house ran on the fumes of its former glory, never questioning why the butcher's bills were paid, or how the maid's wages always appeared on time. My worth was calculated in secret, in columns of ink, a silent, thankless accounting that kept the floorboards beneath their feet. The catalyst for this final, desperate gambit was a letter that had arrived 2 weeks prior. It was edged in black and sealed with a crest that made my father's hand tremble. A debt, old and vast, had been called in. The creditor was the estate of the late Duke of Alistair, now managed by his son and heir, the formidable Arthur St. Clair, the new Duke. He was a man spoken of in whispers, a recluse since the death of his young wife years ago, a figure of immense wealth and sorrow. He was coming to our modest, mortgaged home of Seabrook, not for a social call, but to inspect the property he was soon to own. My stepmother, in a stroke of what she called brilliance and I called folly, had decided to offer him a different asset instead, her beautiful, biddable daughter. And so the house was thrown into a frenzy of preparation, of polishing silver that was mostly plate, and mending curtains that were mostly threadbare, all for the viewing of the pretty one. I was not expected to be part of the official presentation. My role was to remain in the wings, a stagehand in the grand theatre of Lavinia's courtship. When the day arrived, The air itself seemed to hold its breath, thick with the scent of beeswax and my stepmother's nervous perfume. I watched from the top of the stairs as the Duke's carriage, a severe black lacquered box drawn by 4 matching greys, crunched to a halt on our gravel drive. The man who emerged was taller than I had imagined, and the mourning he wore was not mere convention. It seemed to have seeped into his very bones. He moved with a kind of contained stillness, his face a mask of aristocratic severity, his eyes shadowed and remote. He was not a man to be charmed by a pretty face, I thought, with a strange, sinking feeling. He was a man who had seen the world and found it wanting. Lavinia was breathtaking. My stepmother had outdone herself. She was a vision in pale blue silk, her hair a cascade of perfect curls, her smile tremulous and lovely. She was arranged on the settee in the drawing room like a piece of priceless art, positioned so the afternoon light from the window would catch the gold in her hair. My father hovered, sweating in his best coat, while my stepmother steered the Duke towards her masterpiece with the grim determination of a general. I was tasked with the tea. It was a deliberate demotion, a way to ensure I was present but occupied, a servant in my own home. I carried the heavy silver tray, my hands steady, despite the frantic beating of my heart. I did not look at him. I looked at the cups, at the wavering surface of the tea, at the worn pattern on the rug. It was the rug that betrayed me. A thread, loose for years, caught the heel of my shoe. I did not fall, but I stumbled, a graceless lurch that sent the cups rattling in their saucers. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. My stepmother's face was a study in fury. Lavinia looked mortified. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck, a burning confirmation of my own clumsiness, my own inadequacy. I righted myself, my eyes still fixed on the tray, expecting a word of dismissal, a sharp command to leave. Instead, there was only silence, a deep, profound silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. And then I felt it, a gaze. Not a glance, not the polite sweep of a guest's eyes, but a direct, unnerving weight of attention. I lifted my head, compelled by a force I could not name. The Duke of Alistair was looking at me. His eyes, which I had thought cold and distant, were a dark, piercing blue, and they were fixed on my face, with an intensity that stripped away the rattling teacups, the threadbare room, the very air I was breathing. He was not looking at the pretty one. He was looking at the drab dress, the plain face, the clumsy girl in the corner. And in that look I saw not disdain, not irritation, but a flicker of something else, something I could not yet name. It was a look of sharp, sudden, and complete recognition, as if he had been expecting to find me there all along. The carefully constructed social script of the afternoon had not just been broken, it had been set on fire. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I did not feel invisible. I felt seen. The days that followed were a study in confusion for my stepmother, and a quiet, terrifying hope for me. The Duke did not, as expected, make an offer for Lavinia's hand and our subsequent salvation, nor did he seize the house and cast us out. He simply stayed. He took rooms at the local inn and returned to Seabrook each day, his visits becoming a source of rampant speculation in our small coastal village. My stepmother continued to push Lavinia forward, arranging walks in the garden and intimate musical evenings, but the Duke's attention seemed to drift, his gaze often settling on the corner of the room where I sat with my mending, or on the doorway as I passed through on some household errand. Then came the first of his strange requests. He announced one afternoon that he wished for a tour of the gardens, which had once been my mother's pride, but were now a beautiful, tangled wilderness. Lavinia was presented, bonneted and beaming, ready to be his guide. But the Duke, with a polite but immovable firmness, addressed my stepmother directly. "I should prefer," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air, "if Miss Eleanor would accompany me. I have some questions about the local flora, and I am told she is the more knowledgeable botanist." It was a fabrication, of course, but a masterful one. I knew the names of the wildflowers that choked the rose bushes, but little else. My stepmother's smile froze on her face, a brittle mask of civility, but she could not refuse a duke. That walk was an exercise in breathless tension. We moved along the overgrown paths, a proper distance between us, the air thick with the scent of salt and honeysuckle. He did not ask about the flora. He asked about me. He asked what I read, what I thought of the political news from London, how I found life in a place so removed from the world. His questions were not idle pleasantries. They were precise and probing, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. I answered him in quiet, measured tones, unused to having my opinions solicited, let alone listened to with such focused attention. He spoke of his own life in London, of the crushing weight of duties he had never sought, of the profound emptiness that haunted his grand houses. He did not speak of his late wife, but her ghost was there between us, a shared, unspoken sorrow that seemed to connect his grief to my loneliness. His next visit took him directly to the library. It was my sanctuary, a small, dusty room filled with my late mother's books, the one place I felt wholly myself. He found me there, curled in a worn armchair with a volume of Virgil. He did not apologize for the intrusion, but went straight to the shelves, his long fingers trailing over the worn leather spines. "The Aeneid," he said, tapping the book in my lap. "A difficult journey in search of a home." His eyes met mine over the top of the book, and I felt a jolt of connection so sharp it was almost painful. We spoke for over an hour, not of weather or social gossip, but of epic poetry, of duty, and of fate. It was a conversation unlike any I had ever had, a true meeting of minds that left me feeling dizzy and exhilarated. He saw past the plain face and the mended dress. He saw the landscape of my mind, and he found it interesting. It was a more profound intimacy than any touch. The secret kindnesses began a few days later. My bedchamber was in the north wing of the house, a cold, damp room that even in summer held a persistent chill. One morning, I opened my door to find a neatly stacked pile of seasoned oak logs on the threshold, far superior to the greenwood we usually burned. The servants professed ignorance, and my stepmother would never have countenanced such an expense. I knew, with a certainty that made my heart ache, who had sent it. A few days after that, I returned to the library to find a heavy merino wool shawl, the colour of deep heather, draped over the back of my favourite reading chair. It was exquisitely soft and impossibly warm. There was no note, no card, just the silent, thoughtful gift waiting for me in my refuge. It was a gesture of such specific care, a clear sign that he had been watching, that he had noticed my shivers in the draughty room, that he had seen a small, unspoken need and met it without fanfare. Kindness from my family always came with invisible invoices, a debt of gratitude I was expected to repay. This kindness was a gift, freely given, and it undid me. The tension between us grew, a fine, shimmering wire drawn taut in the air whenever we were near. It culminated one afternoon in the library. We both reached for the same book on a high shelf, a collection of Donne's sonnets. His hand covered mine, his fingers long and warm against my own. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a shockwave through my entire body. We froze, our hands still touching on the spine of the book, the dust motes dancing in the slanted ribbon of light between us. I could feel the heat of his skin, the slight tremor in his hand. He did not pull away. He simply held my gaze, his dark blue eyes searching my face, and the silence in the room became a roar in my ears. It was a moment that stretched into an eternity, a question asked and answered without a single word. He finally withdrew his hand, his movements slow and deliberate. He took the book from the shelf and held it, not offering it to me, but simply looking at its cover as if he had forgotten what it was. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet, almost rough. "I find I am weary of the formalities that keep us at a distance." He looked at me then, his expression one of grave seriousness. "I would be honoured if you would call me Arthur." It was more shocking than a declaration of love. It was a breach of every rule of propriety, a dismantling of the fortress of his title. The Duke of Alastair was a remote and powerful entity. Arthur was a man. By inviting me to use his name, he was inviting me into his world, behind the walls of grief and duty he had built so carefully around himself. It was an offering of trust, an act of profound intimacy that felt more binding than any vow. And as I stood there, the warmth of his hand still tingling on my skin, I knew that the quiet, predictable course of my life had been irrevocably altered. The fragile hope that had taken root in my heart was a tender, precarious thing, and it was torn out by its roots on a Tuesday. I had gone to my father's study, a room he now rarely used, in search of a misplaced account book. The room smelled of dust and despair, of neglected ledgers and the faint, sweet scent of brandy. My father's desk was a chaotic mountain of unpaid bills and threatening letters, a testament to his complete inability to manage his own affairs. It was my secret, sorrowful task to impose some order on this chaos, to shield him from the full extent of his own folly. As I sorted through the papers, my fingers brushed against a thick, vellum envelope tucked beneath a stack of invoices. It was addressed, not to my father, but to the solicitor of the Alastair estate. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was not a personal letter, but a cold, legal document, a formal notice of foreclosure. It detailed, in mercilessly precise language, the full extent of my family's debt to the late Duke, a sum so staggering it made me feel faint. The document stated that, as the loan was now in default, the entire Seabrook estate, including the house and all its lands, was to be forfeit to the new Duke of Alastair. The date on the letter was from a month ago. The due date for payment had passed 2 weeks before Arthur had even arrived. The words blurred before my eyes. A cold wave of understanding washed over me, so chilling it felt like a physical blow. His visit was not a social call. His interest was not in Lavinia, nor, I now saw with sickening clarity, was it in me. It was the detached interest of a new landlord inspecting his property. His walks in the garden, his questions about the estate, his time in the library assessing the collection. It was all an inventory, an appraisal of the assets he had come to claim. And his kindness to me? The conversations, the gift of firewood, the shawl. That was the cruelest cut of all. It was a performance, a calculated act of charm to ensure the transition of ownership was smooth and without incident. Perhaps he thought a few small kindnesses to the plain, overlooked daughter would make us more compliant when the eviction notice was finally served. I was not a puzzle he was trying to solve. I was a tenant he was placating. The key I had felt turning in a lock inside my chest had not been opening a door to a shared future. It had been locking me into a cage of my own foolish, naive hope. The pain was a sharp physical thing, a shard of ice in my heart. I found him in the rose garden, trimming a dead branch with a pair of shears. He looked up as I approached, a rare small smile touching his lips, but it vanished when he saw my face. I did not speak. I simply held out the letter, my hand perfectly steady. The rustle of the vellum was the only sound between us. He took it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the familiar legal text. He knew instantly what it was, and what it meant that I had found it. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "In my father's desk," I replied, my own voice a stranger's, devoid of all emotion. "It seems we have been entertaining you under false pretenses, Your Grace. You are not our guest. You are our landlord, our master." The formal title was a deliberate cruelty, a wall I was rebuilding between us as fast as I could. He flinched as if I had struck him. "Eleanor, you must let me explain." "Explain what?" I asked, the coldness in my tone a fragile dam against the flood of hurt that threatened to overwhelm me. "That your courtship of my sister was a sham? That your conversations with me were a distraction? Were you assessing the quality of the books in the library before you had them packed and sent to your own estate? Was the firewood a down payment on my family's dignity?" "No," he said, the word sharp, forceful. He took a step towards me, his eyes dark with an emotion I could not decipher. "No, everything you are thinking is wrong." He admitted the truth of the document, his voice heavy with regret. "Yes, I came to Seabrook to settle my father's affairs. This debt was an old, forgotten thing I uncovered in his papers. I came here to see the land, to finalize the legal proceedings. That was my only intention." He paused, his gaze fixed on my face. "Everything else," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "was a catastrophe I did not plan for. You were the catastrophe I did not plan for." He told me then that he had not known what to do. He had arrived as a creditor, a man of business, and had found himself utterly disarmed by a quiet, intelligent woman with sad, grey eyes. He confessed that his carefully ordered world had been thrown into chaos. He had intended to speak to my father, to arrange a private settlement, but he had hesitated, caught between his duty and a new, unfamiliar feeling that was growing more powerful each day. He admitted his kindnesses were not calculation, but impulse. He had seen me shiver and had wanted, with a desperation that surprised him, to make me warm. He had heard the passion in my voice when I spoke of books and had wanted to share that world with me. His feelings for me, he swore, were the only part of this entire affair that were real and unplanned. But standing there, with the cold, hard proof of his legal power in my hand, I did not know if I could believe him. The trust I had so tentatively placed in him was shattered. I stood there, the damning letter in my hand, a physical representation of the chasm that had opened between us. His words were earnest, his expression laced with a pain that mirrored my own, but my heart, which had so recently learned to hope, was now a fortress of doubt. "Why should I believe you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Everything I know of you is built on a foundation of deceit. You are the Duke of Alistair. You hold my family's entire existence in your hands. Your words are a currency I cannot afford to accept." He did not try to argue or protest his innocence further. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced another document. It was folded and sealed, but with his own crest, not a solicitor's. He held it out to me. "This is not for your belief, Eleanor. It is for your security. I had it drawn up last week. I was waiting for the right moment to give it to you, though I confess I had no idea what that moment would be." My fingers were numb as I took it and broke the seal. It was another legal document, but this one was different. It was a deed of release. It stated in clear, unambiguous terms that the debt owed by my father to the Alistair estate was forgiven, in full and in perpetuity. The document was dated 5 days prior, 5 days before I had found the foreclosure notice. He had already acted. He had disarmed himself, relinquishing the very power I accused him of holding over me, and he had done so in secret. I looked up from the page, my throat tight. He had not done it to win my favour, for I had known nothing of it. He had done it simply because it was the right thing to do, because he could not, or would not, hold that power over the woman he was coming to. What? The thought was too immense to complete. "My feelings for you, Eleanor," he began, his voice low and raw with emotion, "have been the most profound inconvenience of my life." He took a step closer, and this time I did not retreat. "For 5 years, since my wife's death, I have been a ghost in my own life. I have managed my duties, upheld my title, and felt nothing. My world was a landscape of grey, orderly and silent. And then I came here, to this crumbling house on a forgotten coast, and I saw you. You were not meant to be the one I saw, but you were standing in a corner, holding a tea tray as if it were the weight of the world, and you had the most astonishingly expressive eyes I had ever seen. They held a universe of intelligence and sorrow, and a strength that you tried so desperately to hide. He was standing before me now, so close I could see the flecks of silver in his dark blue eyes. "You have unmade me, Eleanor Vance. You have dismantled the man I was, piece by piece, with your quiet observations and your fierce mind. You do not see a duke when you look at me. You see a man, and you are the first person in years to do so. The thought of using this miserable debt to cause you a moment's pain became unbearable. I could not do it. I love you. I do not say it lightly. I say it as a man who thought he would never feel anything again. It is not a calculation. It is a confession. The words, so simple and so profound, broke through the last of my defences. The vulnerability in his voice, the raw truth in his eyes, was undeniable. This was not the cold, calculating Duke from my fears. This was Arthur, a man laid bare, offering me the shattered pieces of his heart and trusting me to hold them. The deed in my hand was not just a legal document. It was proof. It was a shield he had forged for me before I even knew I was in danger. "I believe you," I whispered, and the two words felt like a vow. A tear I hadn't realised was forming slipped down my cheek, and he reached out, his thumb gently brushing it away. His touch was hesitant, reverent. In that moment, we were not a duke and a penniless dependent. We were two lonely souls who had, against all odds, found a flicker of light in one another. An alliance was forged in that overgrown garden, a silent pact to face the ruins of our pasts and build something new together. Our newfound peace was, of course, destined to be short-lived. My stepmother, blind to the quiet currents that now flowed between Arthur and myself, saw only that her prize was slipping from her grasp. She redoubled her efforts, her desperation lending a sharp, manic edge to her schemes. The final act of her tragedy was set for the Endicott's annual assembly ball, the last grand social event of the season. It was there she planned to force Arthur's hand, to corner him into a public declaration that would bind him to Lavinia and secure their future. The ballroom was a glittering, overwrought spectacle of chandeliers and wilting flowers. I had not wanted to attend, but Arthur had insisted, his hand briefly squeezing mine in the carriage. "We will face this together," he had murmured, a promise that bolstered my courage. I wore a simple grey silk, a dress I had remade myself, while Lavinia was paraded in a new gown of ivory satin that must have cost my father his last shilling. My stepmother was a whirlwind of brittle smiles and sharp glances, her eyes constantly tracking Arthur as he moved through the crowd. She made her move near the grand staircase, a place where the acoustics were excellent and a crowd could easily gather. She cornered Arthur, her fan fluttering like a trapped bird. Lavinia, pale and anxious at her side. "Your Grace," she began, her voice carrying across the polished floor. "We are all so delighted by the particular attention you have shown our family, and my dear Lavinia in particular." A murmur went through the assembled guests. This was it, the moment she had engineered. "I feel it is only proper to announce the understanding that has grown between our houses. A betrothal is, of course, imminent." A collective gasp went through the room. Arthur's face remained impassive, a mask of calm control. Before he could speak, my stepmother turned her venomous gaze on me, where I stood a few feet away. "And as for my other daughter," she said, her voice dripping with false pity, "I am sure we can all forgive her attempts to prey upon His Grace's good nature. A penniless dependent, lost in grief as he is, one must make allowances for such desperate ambition." The insult was so public, so cruel, that for a moment I could not breathe. I was a predator, an opportunist, my genuine connection with Arthur twisted into something ugly and transactional. But then I felt his presence beside me, solid and unwavering. He did not raise his voice. He did not engage in her theatrical display. He simply looked at my stepmother with a gaze of glacial calm. "Madam," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced the entire room. "You are mistaken on several points." He reached into his coat, the same gesture I had seen in the garden, and produced a folded document. "Firstly, there is no understanding regarding Miss Lavinia. My intentions have always been directed elsewhere." He unfolded the paper. "Secondly, the term penniless dependent is inaccurate. As of last week, the full and unencumbered deed to the Seabrook estate was placed into a trust." He let a beat of silence hang in the air. "The sole beneficiary of that trust is my future wife." He turned his head and looked directly at me, his eyes full of a fierce, protective love. "Miss Eleanor Vance." The shock in the room was a palpable thing. My stepmother's face crumpled, her mask of triumph dissolving into disbelief and then into pure, unadulterated fury. But the moment was no longer hers. A strength I did not know I possessed rose up in me. I stepped forward, my back straight, my head held high. I was no longer the shadow in the corner. I met my stepmother's horrified gaze. My voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it cut through the silence. "For 10 years," I began, speaking not to the crowd, but directly to her, "I have been the one to manage the household. While you were ordering new gowns and my father was drowning his sorrows, I was the one poring over the ledgers by candlelight. I was the one who negotiated with the butcher, who stretched every pound, who kept the roof over our heads with nothing but ink and arithmetic. You speak of my ambition. My only ambition was to keep our family from ruin, a task I performed in secret, without thanks, while you presented the pretty one for sale." I looked at Lavinia, whose eyes were filled with tears, not of anger, but of a dawning, horrified understanding. "My worth is not in my face or my dowry. It is in my hands and in my head, and I will not allow you to slander it any longer." The defeat of my stepmother was swift and absolute. There was no defence against the quiet, unassailable truth. Arthur placed a hand on the small of my back, a gesture of silent, unwavering support. The public vindication was complete. I had not been saved by a duke. I had stood beside him and claimed my own power, my own story. We turned, together, and walked away from the wreckage of my family's ambition, leaving the whispers and the stares behind us. We did not speak as we left the ball, the glittering chaos of the assembly room fading behind us like a bad dream. Arthur led me through the cool night air to his carriage, his hand a warm, steady presence on my arm. He gave a quiet instruction to his driver, and instead of turning towards my home, the carriage began a slow ascent up the coastal road, climbing towards the high cliffs that overlooked the sea. We came to a stop at a familiar overlook, a place where I had often walked alone, a windswept ridge where the land gave way to an endless expanse of dark, churning water, and a sky littered with stars. He helped me down, and we stood together at the edge of the world, the wind whipping strands of hair across my face and tugging at the fabric of my dress. The silence between us was no longer tense or uncertain. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, the silence of two people who had weathered a storm and found safe harbour in one another. He turned to face me, his tall frame a silhouette against the starlight. He reached out and gently cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of my jaw. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low murmur against the sigh of the wind and waves. "You were magnificent." There was no triumph in his tone, only a deep, abiding awe. He was not praising a victory, but acknowledging the strength he had seen in me from the very beginning. And in his eyes, I saw the reflection of a woman I was only just beginning to recognize as myself. Not plain, not invisible, but strong and whole and worthy. He lowered his head, and his kiss was not the hesitant, questioning touch of a new romance, but the deep, certain kiss of a man coming home. It was a kiss full of relief and promise, a sealing of the pact we had made in the garden. It spoke of shared libraries and quiet evenings, of facing the world together, of a love that was not built on beauty or advantage, but on the profound, miraculous recognition of another soul. It was the end of all the tension, the resolution of every fear, and the true beginning of our lives. Weeks later, we were married. The ceremony was a quiet affair in the small parish church, with only a few trusted friends and a humbled, contrite Lavinia as witnesses. Afterwards, we returned not to Seabrook, but to Blackwood Manor, Arthur's ancestral home. It was a place of stone and shadow, a house that had been steeped in grief for 5 long years. But as I walked through its echoing halls, my hand resting in my husband's, I did not feel the weight of the past. I felt only the promise of the future. We filled the silent rooms with books and conversation, and slowly, gently, we let the light back in. My new life was a world away from the one I had known. I was a duchess, a title that felt foreign and strange, but Arthur never let me feel like anything other than his partner. We managed the vast estates together, my mind for figures and his knowledge of land proving a formidable combination. In the evenings we would sit in the enormous book-lined library, a fire roaring in the hearth, and read to one another, our quiet companionship a bulwark against the world outside. I was no longer a shadow. I was the lady of the house, respected by the staff and cherished by my husband. I had found my place. We received a letter from Lavinia not long after our marriage. Freed from our stepmother's suffocating ambition, she had blossomed. She had refused a string of socially advantageous suitors and had instead accepted the hand of a local doctor, a kind, good man with whom she was genuinely in love. Her letter was full of joy and gratitude, and a heartfelt apology for the years she had been a willing participant in my effacement. I wrote back immediately, wishing her every happiness and assuring her she was forgiven. Our stepmother and father, we heard, had retired to a small, damp cottage in Bath, their social standing in ruins. I felt not triumph, but a quiet pity for them, for a life spent chasing phantoms of status and wealth. One crisp autumn evening, Arthur and I were walking along the terrace, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. He stopped and took my hands in his expression serious. "Are you happy here, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice full of a tender concern that still had the power to move me to my core. I looked at his face, the face I now knew better than my own, and then out at the sprawling lands that were our home, I thought of the quiet girl in the drab dress, the invisible daughter who had believed her life would be lived entirely in the margins. I had once thought that home was a place you were given, a set of walls to contain you. But I had been wrong. Home was not a place, it was a person. It was being seen, truly and completely, for who you were. I smiled, a real, unhesitant smile that reached my eyes. I am not happy here, I told him, watching a flicker of worry cross his face before I continued. I am happy with you. And with you, Arthur, I am home anywhere.